The year is 1940. Europe lies breathless beneath the shadow of the Third Reich. In the West, France has fallen in a shocking 6 weeks. In the East, Poland has been brutally dismantled. And dominating the skies over the Channel, the formidable, seemingly unstoppable aerial armada known as the Luftwaffe reigns supreme. They are the hammer of the Blitzkrieg, a technical marvel built on the doctrine of speed, surprise, and decisive air superiority. The world watches in terror, convinced that German air power is limitless, invincible. Yet, within the secretive, cloistered halls of the Reich Ministry of Aviation (RLM) in Berlin, among the very men responsible for crafting this aerial juggernaut, one voice dared to utter a chilling counter-truth. One engineer, brilliant, precise, and utterly devoid of the blind fanaticism that gripped his nation, saw past the dazzling victories of the moment and into the inevitable gloom of the future. This man was Dr. Willy Messerschmitt, or an engineer of similar high stature, such as Kurt Tank or Ernst Heinkel. Let us call him Dr. Erich Keller for narrative purposes, embodying the prophetic, ignored voice of reason. He was not a political agitator, he was a scientist and a pragmatist. His warning was not based on wishful thinking or sentiment, but on the cold, hard logic of industrial output, raw material supply, and, critically, long-term strategic doctrine. In the early summer of 1940, while the rest of the RLM was still celebrating the fall of Paris and planning the invasion of Britain, Dr. Keller compiled a restricted memorandum that landed like a lead weight on the desks of his superiors. It was a technical treatise disguised as a prophecy. His prediction: the Luftwaffe was not built to win a long war, it was built to collapse. The core of Keller's analysis rested on the fundamental design flaws in the German strategic concept, the doctrine of the short war. The Blitzkrieg was predicated on rapid, localized air superiority. German aircraft were designed for speed, agility, and attack range adequate for striking targets immediately across their borders. The most successful fighters, like the Bf-109, were masterpieces of efficient, light construction. They were optimized for short, sharp bursts of combat and rapid turnaround. But Keller pointed out the critical deficiency. The industrial Achilles heel. 1. Resources and complexity. Keller argued that the German aeronautical industry relied too heavily on strategic imports, like molybdenum and tungsten, and high-quality aluminums, which were difficult to synthesize or source domestically. Furthermore, the highly specialized, hand-built nature of German engine manufacturing, particularly the Daimler-Benz and BMW inline engines, meant production could not be quickly scaled or simplified. The DB601 engine, a jewel of engineering precision, required thousands of meticulous man-hours to produce. Keller wrote, "Our superiority is built on complexity. The moment the war transitions from a campaign of months to a war of attrition spanning years, this complexity will become a ball and chain. The Allies, particularly the Americans, are capable of building simpler, robust, and ultimately expendable airframes at a mass production scale we cannot match." 2. The absence of the strategic bomber. The most damning part of Keller's analysis was the German failure to develop a true four-engine strategic bomber. The Luftwaffe had committed entirely to tactical air support, epitomized by the Junkers Ju-87 Feet Stuka dive bomber and the twin-engine medium bombers like the Heinkel He-111. This doctrine was perfect for supporting mechanized armies on the move, but utterly useless for striking the industrial heartlands of the Soviet Union or, most critically, the factory cities of North America. Keller foresaw the shift. He warned that once the British and Americans perfected their heavy bombers, the Lancaster, the B-17 Flying Fortress, and the B-24 Liberator, they would gain an industrial advantage the Luftwaffe could neither counter nor destroy. He proposed redirecting significant resources immediately to the development of a Ural bomber, a long-range heavy aircraft capable of hitting deep targets. He was met with blank stares. Goring famously declared that any bomber capable of reaching the Urals or New York was unnecessary. 3. Training and attrition rate. Keller's most human argument concerned the pilots. The Luftwaffe maintained an incredibly rigorous, high-quality pilot training program. Their pilots were superior in 1940. However, this level of training required hundreds of hours of flight time and extensive fuel resources, which Germany was already short on. The Allies, anticipating high attrition rates, were streamlining their pilot training, creating a pilot factory capable of replacing losses almost instantly, albeit with initially less experienced crews. "We are treating pilots like irreplaceable, highly polished tools," Keller observed. The enemy will treat them like bolts, mass-produced and easily replaced. When attrition mounts, we will lose 1,000-hour ace for every 100-hour novice they lose. In a war of numbers, the ace is the first to be eliminated by sheer probability. The prophecy ignored. When Keller presented his findings to the RLM leadership, he faced not intellectual debate, but a wave of ideological euphoria and political denial. Field Marshal Milch, the RLM's effective head, dismissed the report as defeatist mathematical pessimism. Hitler himself, obsessed with the intoxicating momentum of victory, believed that the war would be over long before Keller's grim predictions could materialize. The doctrine of blitzkrieg was viewed not as a necessity born of weakness, but as a proof of German superiority. Dr. Keller was quietly marginalized. His long-range bomber proposals were shelved. He was assigned to advanced concept studies, a polite way of burying a dangerous realist. The implications of ignoring Keller's warning were vast. By 1941, when the Battle of Britain stalled and the invasion of Russia began, the Luftwaffe was already overcommitted, fighting a war of attrition on two fronts that its entire industrial and doctrinal structure was never designed to sustain. The production lines continued to churn out excellent tactical fighters like the Bf-109 and Fw-190, but they were locked in a reactive struggle against the ever-increasing numerical superiority of the Allies. Dr. Erich Keller, the man who saw the Luftwaffe's brilliant 1940 peak as merely the prelude to its final, catastrophic collapse, was forced to watch in silent agony as his meticulously calculated graph line, representing the inevitable crossover of Allied production superiority, began its terrifying, unstoppable ascent. The Luftwaffe was marching, eyes wide open, toward its predetermined industrial doom. While the skies over the English Channel were filled with the roar of powerful Daimler-Benz engines and the crackle of machine gun fire, Dr. Erich Keller worked in a world of quiet precision and abstraction. He was not a celebrated designer like Messerschmitt or an organizational titan like Milch. He was a propulsion specialist, a dedicated expert in thermodynamics, material science, and performance analysis, working in a modest, climate-controlled research office located far from the glamour of the design bureaus and the peril of the front lines. Dr. Keller held no military rank beyond a nominal civilian defense title, wore no medals of the Blitzkrieg, and possessed zero political influence within the heavily politicized Reich Ministry of Aviation (RLM). His only currency was his intellect, and his only weapon was the slide rule and the vast, often contradictory, statistical data flowing from the factory floor and the combat reports. He was a pure scientist in an age of fanatical ideologues. His modest office was an oasis of intellectual honesty in a capital city drowning in propaganda. While others cheered Hitler's pronouncements of ultimate victory, Keller was meticulously charting the lifespan of an exhaust valve and calculating the mean time between failures (MTBF) for a complex hydraulic system. But Dr. Keller had something far more dangerous than influence: accurate mathematics. He possessed a deep understanding of the industrial metabolism of the German war effort. He realized that the performance of a fighter in a dogfight was less important than the systemic sustainability of that fighter. A single, spectacular kill ratio meant nothing if the infrastructure that created the plane could not withstand the demands of a protracted global conflict. His calculations, begun in the heady days of 1940 and continued relentlessly through the sobering realities of 1941, were revealing a future that every German commander desperately didn't want to face, a future dictated not by courage or design brilliance, but by the relentless, cold constraints of algebra and logistics. He focused obsessively on the often ignored metrics that lay beneath the headline figures of production. Fuel rates. How many gallons of synthetic fuel were required to train a new pilot versus how much was available? Maintenance man-hours. How long did it take a frontline mechanic to overhaul a highly stressed engine like the DB605, compared to the simpler Allied engines? The spares ratio. How many spare parts, propellers, tail surfaces, undercarriage components were needed to maintain one operational fighter at the front? Keller's work was the ultimate refutation of the Nazi fantasy. The military leadership was obsessed with performance specifications, speed, climb rate, armament. Keller was obsessed with production sustainability, the rate at which Germany could replace a catastrophic loss of a pilot, a plane, and the irreplaceable man-hours required to build them. He knew that the Allies, particularly the emerging industrial giant of the United States, were not building better planes in 1940, but they were building simpler planes designed for rapid, mass production and easy maintenance. The Mustang or the Spitfire could be assembled in a fraction of the time required for a German fighter, using fewer strategic materials. Dr. Keller's mathematics was demonstrating that the gap between German engineering excellence and Allied industrial might was not static, it was widening exponentially. He saw the Battle of Britain not as a glorious struggle against fate, but as a catastrophic exchange rate failure. While the Luftwaffe fought brilliantly, every lost Bf-109 represented a loss of specialized labor, high-grade materials, and a veteran pilot that Germany could not sustainably replace, even as the British were rapidly scaling up their streamlined factories. Dr. Keller was watching the capital investment of the Luftwaffe being annihilated, frame by frame, kilometer by kilometer. At the end of 1941, following the brutal attrition of the Battle of Britain and the exhausting logistical demands of Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, Dr. Keller's initial predictions had metastasized into terrifying certainties. His meticulously assembled data formed a cohesive, irrefutable narrative of impending collapse. He studied the engine wear rates reported from the Eastern Front. The dust, the extreme temperature variations, and the rushed field maintenance were brutally shortening the lifespan of Germany's cutting-edge propulsion systems. The engine attrition crisis. The heart of the German fighter force was the family of Daimler-Benz DB 601 605ths and BMW 801 radial engines. These were engineering marvels, high-powered, fuel-injected, and capable of spectacular performance. But they were also fragile, complex, and maintenance-intensive. Keller's calculations revealed a catastrophic reality: the Luftwaffe was burning through engines faster than Germany could build them. Frontline reality. The MTBF for a DB 605 in frontline service on the Eastern Front dropped dramatically, often failing after only 50 to 80 hours of flight time, due primarily to inadequate oil cooling, rushed repairs, and low-quality wartime fuel. The production bottleneck. The production of a new DB 605 engine required vast quantities of specialized aluminum alloys, precision machining which was being disrupted by Allied bombing, and thousands of skilled man-hours. Crucially, it required enormous numbers of high-tolerance ball bearings, a component entirely reliant on a few, vulnerable factories. The spare parts drain. Keller calculated that to maintain a single operational squadron of 30 fighters, the supply chain needed enough spares to repair or rebuild 50 to 60 engines at any given time, a reserve that simply did not exist. The engines were being cannibalized, leaving wrecks that might have been saved by a single replacement valve or piston ring rotting on airfields. The sheer complexity of the German designs was becoming a fatal liability. The weight of progress. Keller also analyzed the evolution of fighter design itself. He tracked the increasing complexity of the successful fighters. Bf-109 began as a light interceptor. By 1942, subsequent models like the Bf-109G were burdened with heavier armor, bigger cannons, external racks for bombs or fuel tanks, and complex pressurized cockpits. FW-190. The outstanding Werger was similarly forced into multiple roles: fighter-bomber, long-range escort, requiring complex, heavy fittings and systems. Fighter designs were getting heavier, more complex, and harder to maintain. Each added system, the specialized oxygen equipment for high-altitude flying, the heavier cannon mounts, added to the weight, which in turn demanded more powerful, more complex engines, which accelerated the maintenance crisis. Keller's conclusion was brutal. Germany was designing technological masterpieces that were logistical nightmares. The Allied industrial tsunami. In stark contrast, Keller's data on the Allied war machine painted a picture of an accelerating, unstoppable industrial tsunami. He was receiving intelligence, often dismissed as exaggerated by his superiors, on the American capacity for mass production. The Ford factory model. The United States was building aircraft like automobiles. A single factory, like the massive Willow Run plant, was projected to eventually churn out B-24 Liberator bombers at a rate that would soon exceed the total annual German output of all combat aircraft combined. Simplicity and standardization. Allied aircraft, particularly the P-51 Mustang and the P-47 Thunderbolt, were designed for standardization. Their engines, like the American-built Packard Merlin, were robust, easily serviced, and could be produced on a massive scale. Keller's final, terrifying graph showed the crossover point, the inevitable moment when the combined industrial output of the Allies would surpass the entirety of the Luftwaffe's current strength and its replacement capacity. He projected this point would be decisively crossed in late 1943 or early 1944, precisely when the invasion of Europe was expected. His final report, submitted with the stark simplicity of an actuary detailing bankruptcy, stated that the Luftwaffe was not losing the air war in the skies over Germany, it was losing it on the assembly lines of Detroit and Wichita. The deficit was not one of courage, but of steel, aluminum, man-hours, and, most crushingly, foresight. The German commanders, steeped in the initial victories and blinded by the dogma of technological supremacy, desperately didn't want to face this mathematical certainty. Dr. Keller's prophetic report was filed away, labeled as alarmist and unpatriotic. He was, after all, only an engineer. What could a slide rule know of the glorious destiny of the Reich? He was ignored, and the inevitable collapse he charted continued its steady, brutal march toward the skies of Germany. By the late autumn of 1942, following the brutal, unyielding attrition on the Eastern Front and the commencement of sustained, deep penetration Allied bombing raids in the West, Dr. Erich Keller knew he could no longer afford the luxury of quiet speculation. The mathematical crisis he had charted was no longer a theoretical projection, it was a devastating reality unfolding over German cities and Soviet steppes. Working in a furious, solitary burst of effort that spanned weeks, Dr. Keller compiled every shred of his data, the engine wear rates, the strategic material deficits, the mounting spare parts liabilities, and the alarming projections of Allied output, into a single, unified document. The result was a 32-page report, designated simply, RLM Operational Sustainability Analysis, Section B7. It was a document of breathtaking clarity and brutal honesty, structured not as a military assessment but as a scientific proof. It detailed, with irrefutable charts and graphs, the logistical insolvency of the Luftwaffe. The core of his argument was built around the terrifying mathematics of total war mobilization. Keller illustrated that while Germany possessed the qualitative edge in design, the Allies, led by the colossal industrial might of the United States, possessed an overwhelming quantitative edge. He calculated the industrial output ratio of German aluminum, steel, and high-grade aviation gasoline against that of the Allied nations. The deficit was staggering. Keller's conclusion, printed in stark, unadorned typeface on the final page, was blunt, terrifying, and utterly devoid of Nazi rhetoric. Based on current material consumption, pilot attrition rates, and projected enemy production capacity, the Luftwaffe will no longer be able to sustain effective combat operations by late 1943, and will face total systemic collapse by 1944. He didn't just offer doom, he offered a desperate blueprint for survival. Keller warned that without radical, immediate changes, Germany would inevitably lose the skies. His recommendations were a direct repudiation of every current tenet of RLM doctrine. Radical design simplification. Immediately cease production of over-engineered, complex fighters like the later Bf-109G models. Switch to lighter fighters designed for rapid mass production, simple, robust airframes that required fewer strategic materials and less skilled man-hours to build. Engine standardization. Abandon the pursuit of bespoke, highly tuned propulsion systems. Focus all efforts on the most basic, simplest engine design capable of 1,000 horsepower, standardizing parts across multiple platforms to ease the spare parts crisis. Decentralized production. Stop relying on massive, centralized factories that were vulnerable to area bombing. Move production into hundreds of small, camouflaged, decentralized workshops and underground facilities to mitigate the impact of the coming Allied strategic offensive. Strategic prioritization. Immediately halt resource allocation for prestige projects like bomber variants of the Me-262 or overly complex heavy fighters, and dedicate 100% of fighter production to homeland defense, a single, simple interceptor. The report was a scream of technical honesty in a chamber of ideological echo. When it circulated through the RLM's planning section, it didn't spark debate, it sparked panic. For the first time, the bureaucrats and career officers were confronted with a professional, non-political analysis that declared their entire strategic foundation rotten. Fear of the truth, however, soon gave way to the deep, ingrained political reflex of denial. The significance of Dr. Keller's report was too great to simply vanish. Its stark conclusions reached the office of Field Marshal Erhard Milch, the man essentially running the RLM's production and supply. Milch, recognizing the cold logic behind the numbers, could not simply dismiss the work outright, yet he also understood the political suicide of presenting such a defeatist document to Göring or, God forbid, the Führer. A clandestine, high-level meeting was convened in a guarded RLM conference room in early 1943. Present were Milch, several high-ranking procurement generals, and key engineering directors. Dr. Keller, the unassuming propulsion specialist, was the only person present without a general's epaulet or a director's title. Keller presented his findings with the same dispassionate clarity he used to analyze stress fractures. He used visual aids, charts projecting the Allied ramp-up of the P-51 Mustang and the B-17 Flying Fortress against the dwindling German supplies of copper and nickel. He calmly explained the mathematics of compound attrition, proving that Germany's loss rate was unsustainable due to the complexity of replacement. The senior Luftwaffe officials listened in silence. The air in the room was thick with professional discomfort and suppressed fear. They were brilliant men, many of them excellent pilots or engineers, and they understood the integrity of Keller's figures. He wasn't lying. When Keller finished, the silence stretched, heavy and complete, punctuated only by the nervous shifting of paper. The fate of the Luftwaffe hung suspended in that moment. Would they face the truth, however ugly? Would they use this data to launch the radical, life-saving reforms Keller advocated? Then came the response, delivered not by Milch, who remained quietly thoughtful, but by Generaloberst Alfred Kesselring, the director of Luftwaffe procurement, a man whose career was built on pleasing Göring and Hitler. Kesselring leaned forward, his face hardening into an expression of ideological disdain. Dr. Keller, your numbers are neat, but they lack soul. You underestimate German spirit. You fundamentally overestimate American industry. This response was the political coup de grace. It dismissed science not with counter-evidence, but with dogma. The German spirit, the myth of Aryan technological and moral superiority, was deemed sufficient to overcome the statistical reality of 2 billion tons of American steel. The other generals quickly fell in line. One procurement officer suggested that the U.S. statistics were merely Jewish propaganda. Another pointed to the nascent jet program, the Me-262, as the ultimate solution, rendering all calculations of piston engine sustainability moot. They were clinging to the Wunderwaffen, the miracle weapon, as an escape route from the statistical trap. The meeting concluded with a chilling finality. Dr. Keller's 32-page report, the document that contained the last honest chance for the Luftwaffe to save itself, was immediately stamped, too pessimistic, by Kesselring's aide. The report was then quietly shelved, buried deep in the archives, destined to be unearthed years later by Allied historians as proof of German industrial blindness. Dr. Keller himself was officially reprimanded. He was ordered to focus on practical tasks, instead of defeatist speculation. The message was unmistakable. Reality was subservient to rhetoric. Honesty was treason. The engineer left the room not with bitterness, but with a profound, cold certainty. He had done his duty. He had delivered the warning. The commanders, choosing to silence the truth for the sake of political expediency and ideological fantasy, had signed the death warrant of the Luftwaffe. Over the next 18 months, Dr. Keller's grim prediction played out with terrifying accuracy. The Allied bombing offensive accelerated, the engine losses mounted, and the raw material deficits became crises. By late 1944, German pilots were flying fewer hours in training. Fuel was critically rationed, and their aircraft were literally falling apart due to the inability to secure basic replacement parts. The skies above the Reich had indeed fallen, precisely on schedule, and the man who saw it coming was the same quiet engineer whose mathematics was deemed less valuable than a commander's pride. The year 1943 dawned over the Reich not with the promise of victory, but with the cold, unforgiving precision of Dr. Erich Keller's mathematical projections. The statistical lines he had drawn 3 years earlier, the lines that showed the inevitable crossover of Allied production superiority and the terminal decline of German industrial reserves, were now intersecting with brutal reality. Keller, marginalized and forbidden from defeatist speculation, watched in grim, silent confirmation as the intricate, complex machine he had analyzed began to seize up, precisely in the manner he had forewarned. The first signs were subtle, then became a tidal wave of systemic failure. The most critical point of failure was the engine inventory. Keller's central thesis, that the Daimler-Benz DB605 and BMW 801 engines were too complex and material-intensive to replace at the current attrition rate, was proven daily on the front lines. By 1943, the German factories couldn't replace lost engines fast enough to meet demand. The Allied strategic bombing campaign, now targeting precision objectives like the Schweinfurt ball bearing plants, hammered the already fragile German supply chain. Without those tiny, high-tolerance steel bearings, the production of the massive, complex engines ground to a halt. Reports flooding the RLM, reports Keller was privy to only through secondary channels, detailed the horrific consequences. Entire squadrons of the newest Messerschmitt Bf-109G and Focke-Wulf Fw-190A fighters were grounded for lack of parts. They sat clustered on airfields across France and the Eastern Front, magnificent, armed, and utterly inert. It was not a lack of airframes that doomed the Luftwaffe, it was the crippling, total absence of the highly specialized components required to turn those airframes into fighting machines. The second crucial pillar of Keller's prophecy was the fuel crisis. The war on the ground, particularly the immense, fuel-consuming retreat from Stalingrad and the subsequent battles on the Eastern Front, placed an impossible burden on Germany's synthetic fuel reserves. By the summer of 1943, fuel shortages became catastrophic for the Luftwaffe. Fighter pilots, the irreplaceable tools Keller had warned about, were no longer receiving the hundreds of flight hours needed for advanced combat training. New recruits were thrown into dogfights with barely 50 hours in the cockpit, their inexperience leading to instantaneous, massive attrition when they met seasoned Allied veterans like the Americans flying the P-51 Mustang. The operational solution at the airfields became a desperate, morally corrosive practice: cannibalization. Maintenance crews, driven to ingenious extremes by necessity, were tearing apart airframes faster than they were fixing them. The standard joke among the Feldwebel sergeants was that to fly one Fw-190, you needed 3 to be delivered as spare parts. Maintenance crews were cannibalizing dozens of aircraft just to keep one in the air. A pilot might successfully land his damaged fighter, only to watch mechanics swarm it and immediately strip its propeller, landing gear, or working engine to keep a different plane in the air. This practice guaranteed a shrinking total force and the permanent loss of vast numbers of airframes that, under normal circumstances, would have been easily repaired. But still, amidst the smoke, the grounded planes, and the crushing numbers of pilot losses, the High Command ignored him. Generaloberst Kesselring and the RLM leadership dismissed the mounting evidence as temporary setbacks, the inevitable results of fighting a world war, soon to be solved by new engines or new tactics. To admit Dr. Keller had been right would be to admit their own fundamental, strategic failure, a political impossibility in Hitler's Reich. As Germany's situation worsened dramatically in late 1943, with the Soviets pressing relentlessly in the east and the vast formations of Allied heavy bombers beginning their systematic destruction of German cities in the west, Keller saw one last, fleeting opportunity to intervene. The RLM was entering a phase of frantic, panicky searching for solutions, though mostly in the wrong places. The engineer argued that the only way to break the Allied attrition cycle was to change the fundamental rules of engagement, logistics over performance. He tried once more, submitting a final, simplified proposal to Field Marshal Milch's office. He argued for a radical redesign of the German fighter force, a complete retreat from the pursuit of speed and complexity, replaced by a doctrine of expediency and mass production. His proposal centered on the concept of the Volksjäger, people's fighter, predating the formal project of the same name. He advocated for a lightweight, single-engine fighter, simple to construct, built with non-strategic materials, wood and low-grade steel, powered by a cheap, mass-produced engine like a simplified Argus pulse jet or a redesigned radial, and built by non-skilled labor in scattered, decentralized workshops. This new fighter, he argued, wouldn't outperform the Mustang or the Spitfire. It would merely need to be cheap, expendable, and built in overwhelming numbers. The goal was to flood the skies with enough simple interceptors to dilute the Allied attack and preserve the few existing top-tier aircraft. It was the industrial equivalent of triage. But Dr. Keller's sensible, salvation-based pragmatism collided head-on with the delusions of the Nazi leadership. The officers, blinded by years of propaganda and desperate to avoid admitting defeat, were obsessed with glamorous, miracle projects, the Wunderwaffen. Jet obsession. Hitler and Göring had fixated on the Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighter and the Arado AR-234 jet bomber. They believed these machines, which were years away from being ready for true mass production and suffered from their own unique logistical nightmares, like the highly vulnerable jet engine alloy supply, would instantly scare the Allies out of the skies. Rocket fantasy. Resources were poured into the Messerschmitt Me-163 Comet rocket interceptor, a spectacular technical feat capable of blistering speed, but which was functionally useless due to its dangerous, corrosive fuel, T-Stoff, and its limited time of mere minutes. Experimental monsters. Precious reserves were wasted on enormous, complex experimental designs like the Heinkel He-177 heavy bomber, a logistical nightmare that constantly caught fire, and various Americabomber prototypes, projects that were colossal drains on the very resources Keller insisted should be conserved. These jets, rocket planes, and experimental monsters consumed the last vestiges of Germany's specialized labor, its high-grade alloys, and its aviation fuel. Instead of providing salvation, they acted as a drain on resources that could have gone to fixing the fundamental problems of the piston engine fleet. Every hour spent perfecting a jet engine's turbine blade was an hour not spent building a reliable carburetor for a Bf-109. Dr. Keller watched, powerless, as the Luftwaffe effectively committed suicide. He understood that the genius of German engineering had been utterly defeated by the flaw of German political leadership. They had denied the mathematical truth in 1940, and in 1943, they were choosing to invest their last efforts not in reality, but in technological fantasy. The final destruction of the Luftwaffe in 1944, the year Dr. Keller had predicted for total systemic collapse, came not because of a lack of courage, but because of a devastating, chronic lack of fuel, parts, and pilots. The skies were cleared not by Allied bullets alone, but by the slow, grinding inevitability of a logistics failure charted years earlier by a quiet engineer working with only a slide rule and the cold, unyielding truth of mathematics. His genius lay in seeing not what the Luftwaffe was, but what it could not sustain. The year 1944 was supposed to be the year of the Wunderwaffen, the year Germany unleashed its miracle weapons and snatched victory from the jaws of defeat. Instead, it became the year of the annihilation of the Luftwaffe, the year the German Air Force was systematically erased from the skies. And every failure, every grounded aircraft, every desperate, doomed sortie was a direct, chilling confirmation of the mathematical prophecy Dr. Erich Keller had delivered and the High Command had ignored. The strategic reality of 1944 was defined by a new Allied doctrine, air supremacy. The colossal formations of American B-17s and B-24s, escorted by the long-range P-51 Mustangs, were no longer striking the German periphery, they were flying deep into the heart of the Reich, virtually unopposed. Germany was fighting a defensive war that its industrial base could no longer support. The crisis Keller had meticulously tracked, the intersection of attrition and production failure, now translated into devastating operational figures. Grounded squadrons, fighter groups, the elite units once brimming with dozens of the world's finest aircraft, reported fewer than 30% operational aircraft. The percentage often dipped into the teens. The remaining aircraft were typically cannibalized relics, patched together with parts from 3 or 4 wrecked machines. The logistical supply chain had utterly dissolved. A simple shortage of spark plugs or hydraulic fluid could ground an entire squadron for weeks, rendering the most technically advanced fighting machine useless. The pilot death trap. The most tragic confirmation of Keller's foresight was the collapse of the pilot training system. The fuel shortages, which Keller had warned would become catastrophic, meant training was slashed to the bone. New fighter pilots were rushed through an abbreviated, desperate curriculum. By late 1944, it was common for new recruits to have only 20 minutes of flight training in the actual combat aircraft they were expected to fly, the equivalent of a passenger having a brief orientation before being asked to fly a commercial airliner. They were sent into combat against Allied pilots who had hundreds of hours of experience and the confidence of a dominant air force. The result was instantaneous death. These pilots, tragically nicknamed the Kindervater, child fathers, often crashed before even meeting the enemy. Their high, immediate attrition rate became an unsustainable drain on manpower, completing the circle of collapse Keller had predicted. The High Command's last, desperate hope, the Wunderwaffen, did materialize, but only to confirm Keller's warning about complexity and resource drain. Fuel fiasco. The phenomenal Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighter, the ultimate technological marvel, was hamstrung by the very fuel crisis it was meant to solve. The specific, High-octane kerosene-based fuel it required was incredibly scarce, and the factories to produce it were priority targets for Allied bombers. There were documented cases where fully armed, combat-ready jets had to be towed back to their hangars because they ran out of fuel before takeoff or had to land immediately after a brief test flight, reserving their meager fuel stocks only for the moment of actual Allied attack. The jet was a spectacular design failure on a logistical level. Irreplaceable engines. The jet engines themselves were built with complex, high-nickel alloy turbine blades, the very material Keller had flagged as being in critically short supply. The lifespan of a Jumo 004 jet engine was often measured in tens of hours, not hundreds. When an engine failed, it could not be replaced, reinforcing the systemic failure to maintain the complex equipment. By late 1944, German air control had vanished. The Allied air forces flew where they pleased, when they pleased. Germany had its own airspace, it merely endured the enemy's presence. Keller's report, once dismissed as defeatism, now read like prophecy. It was not a magical prediction, it was a simple, scientific forecast based on undeniable inputs, material availability, production ceilings, and attrition rates. The Germans had chosen to ignore the math, and the math had returned to extract its terrible price. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, the world recoiled from the devastation. For Dr. Erich Keller, the war ended not with a bang, but with a profound, terrifying vindication. He had survived the collapse he had so accurately predicted, living through the final, chaotic months in relative obscurity. Like many brilliant, non-political German engineers and scientists, Keller was interrogated by the advancing Allied intelligence teams, primarily the British and Americans who were desperate to understand the secrets of German aeronautics. When his 32-page report was finally unearthed from the dusty, ignored RLM archives, Allied intelligence was astounded. They had fought the war hoping for such a strategic collapse. Keller had charted it years in advance. However, the engineer's subsequent life was one of quiet anonymity. He returned to academia or perhaps a private industrial firm, rebuilding his life in the fractured, post-war landscape. His name never reached the history textbooks that chronicled the heroic exploits of fighter aces or the grand strategies of field marshals. He wasn't a commander or a hero in the conventional sense, he was just a scientist who dared to tell the truth too early. In the popular narrative of World War II, history remembers the Luftwaffe's sudden, catastrophic collapse. It remembers the burning factories, the doomed pilots, and the technological marvels that arrived too late. This collapse is often attributed to Allied bravery and bombing superiority. But the deeper, more complex truth is that the collapse was almost predicted itself, in the report Germany ignored. Dr. Erich Keller represents the ultimate tragedy of expertise ignored by ideology. His warnings were not based on fear or wishful thinking, but on the cold, hard reality of industrial capacity and the laws of physics and economics. He demonstrated that no amount of fighting spirit or design brilliance can overcome a deficit in steel, fuel, and replacement parts when faced with a superior manufacturing base. His quiet, mathematical foresight remains a powerful, often forgotten lesson, that in total war, logistics is the ultimate weapon. The fate of the Luftwaffe was sealed not in the dogfights over the Channel in 1940, but in the dismissed spreadsheets of an uncelebrated engineer years before the first bomb ever fell on a German engine factory. Dr. Keller, the quiet prophet of the RLM, stands as the eternal symbol of the cost of willful strategic blindness.